Maybe you've experienced this exact moment. You leave the house for something simple, a quick trip, a grocery run, or a family outing, and then it happens. Your child starts getting upset. You try to talk, distract, and fix the situation. But within minutes, everything seems to spiral out of control. The tears get stronger, the yelling starts, and people begin to stare. In those moments, most parents have the same feeling. This came out of nowhere. No, but that's one of the biggest misunderstandings about children's meltdowns, because most of the time the problem didn't start when the child started crying or screaming. What you're seeing is only the final stage of something that was already building inside their brain. And that's the insight that changes everything. When you learn to recognize the signals that appear before the emotional explosion, preventing a meltdown becomes much easier than trying to stop it once it has already started. But first, we need to understand what is actually happening. When a child has a public meltdown, many people immediately think, they're doing this on purpose. They're trying to get something. But real meltdowns usually work very differently. A young child is still developing the ability to control impulses, handle frustration, and regulate intense emotions. Because of that, there are moments when they feel far more than they can manage. When that overload reaches a certain point, the behavior is no longer a conscious choice. It's a reaction. It's the brain trying to deal with emotions and stimuli it simply can't process properly yet. That's why phrases like, calm down, stop crying, you're overreacting, rarely work during a real meltdown. At that moment, emotions are in control, and that's exactly where many parents feel lost. They try to fix the situation when the child's brain is already overwhelmed. But here's the good news. The brain almost always sends warning signs before the emotional explosion, and once you learn to recognize them, many meltdowns can be prevented before they even begin. One of the biggest realizations for many parents is that meltdowns rarely happen without warning. Most of the time, a child's brain sends signals long before the actual crisis begins. The problem is that these signs often seem too small to notice. Maybe the child becomes more irritable than usual. Maybe they start complaining about things that normally don't bother them. Maybe they react more intensely to small frustrations. Or maybe they simply seem different, more restless, more sensitive, harder to satisfy. This is where many adults make an unintentional mistake. They focus only on visible behavior, trying to correct reactions, complaints, or small emotional outbursts. But what really matters is what's happening underneath those behaviors. Because these signs often mean the brain is already spending more energy than it should just to handle the environment around it. And as that emotional load increases, fewer resources are left to deal with new frustrations. That's why something that seems small can suddenly trigger a huge reaction. The wrong toy, a long line, a finished snack, a trip that ended. To an adult, it looks like an overreaction. But to a child who is already emotionally overwhelmed, it may simply be the final push. The meltdown didn't start in that moment. That moment was just when the brain hit its limit. And there's a reason this happens so often in public places, because many of these environments demand far more from a child's brain than adults realize. To an adult, a supermarket, mall, or restaurant is just a normal environment. But for a young child, it can feel completely different. While you're talking or shopping, their brain is processing lights, sounds, unfamiliar people, smells, and constant movement all at once. Everything competes for attention, and a child's brain is still learning how to organize that amount of input. That's why places that feel normal to adults can quickly become overwhelming for a child, especially when they are already tired, hungry, or emotionally sensitive. And here's something important. Not all children have the same tolerance level. Some handle stimulation well, others get overwhelmed much faster. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It simply means every brain processes the world differently. When we understand this, we stop seeing behavior as disobedience and start seeing it as overload. When a child enters a meltdown, many parents feel an immediate pressure to fix the situation, especially when other people are watching. It's natural to want to stop the crying, explain, or correct the behavior. But there is a problem. During a full meltdown, a child cannot process long explanations or complex reasoning. The brain is overwhelmed and focused only on regaining balance. That's why logical arguments rarely work in that moment. Not because the child isn't listening, but because they cannot process the information the way they normally would when calm. This is where the priority shifts. The goal is no longer to teach, it becomes to regulate. A calm presence acts like an emotional anchor, a calm voice, few words, less stimulation, and the feeling of safety from someone they trust. This helps the brain gradually move out of the overwhelmed state. And maybe the hardest part for parents is exactly this, because it requires calm when they themselves are under pressure. But once we understand what is happening, everything changes. We stop seeing the behavior as a battle and start seeing it as a request for help to regain emotional control. And when you put everything we've covered together, one thing becomes clear. Meltdowns are rarely about a single moment. It's not just the broken toy, the long line, or the no they heard. Those situations are only the final trigger of something that has already been building up. Emotional overload was already growing. Their emotional energy was already at the limit, and the warning signs were already there before the explosion. That's why so many parents feel lost. They only see the moment of the crisis, but not the path that led to it. And once you start seeing that path, everything changes. It stops feeling like, my child had a meltdown out of nowhere, and becomes, now I understand what was happening before. This completely changes how we interpret children's behavior, because many reactions that seem extreme are actually a developing brain trying to handle emotions that are simply too big to manage alone. And this doesn't just apply to meltdowns, it applies to fear, anxiety, and other emotional outbursts that seem to appear without explanation. In the end, children are always communicating. Not always with words, but through emotions, reactions, and signals that appear before difficult behavior shows up. This is what we explore here at Before Words. The more you understand what's happening behind behavior, the more prepared you are to respond with calm and confidence. So subscribe now, because the most important signs in childhood are rarely obvious. And the earlier you learn to recognize them, the easier it becomes to understand each stage of your child's development. Because before words, the brain is already telling a story. And here, you learn how to understand it.